Well, hello, cutie. I'm back. And today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel and welcome to the Cute Life. I'm your cult leader, Leah. If you're not new here, thank you for returning for another cult meeting. As often as I can, I try to do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile, where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. I know I've gotten a little off schedule this week, or these past few weeks. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it is a lover and collector of books. That's me. Today's book is As Old as Time, another Disney twisted tale. This is the twisted tale of Beauty and the Beast. But what would have happened if Belle's mother had cursed the beast? What if the enchantress who cursed the prince was actually Belle's mother? Now, spoiler alerts, if you are thinking about reading this book and you don't want to know anything about it, don't watch this video. If you're thinking about reading the book, or you don't want to read the book and you just want to hear a summary about it and you don't mind a few spoilers here and there, you know, I don't tell the whole story because there just isn't time for that, but you will know the ending. Also, I'm going to assume that you've seen the movie Beauty and the Beast, the animated one, the real one, because if you haven't, you're going to be very confused on what is going on in this story. So, if you haven't, for whatever reason, what crazy reason in the universe could there be for not having seen Beauty and the Beast, Disney's Beauty and the Beast? But if you haven't, go do that first, then come back and watch this video or read this book. You're gonna need it. Anyways, so if you're ready to hear the twisted tale of Beauty and the Beast and watch me do my makeup at the same time, well, stay tuned. Oh yeah, that's why I'm wearing a tiara, because we're doing a princess story. All right, so As Old as Time by Liz Braswell, and this book came out in 2016. So this book has kind of a bit of an odd timeline. In the beginning of the book, like the first half or so, there's two timelines going on, and each chapter kind of jumps back and forth between the two timelines. Now the first timeline is everything that happens that leads up to the movie. The second timeline is the movie. But then halfway through the book, the first timeline stops and the movie timeline keeps going, but then it like skews off into a different direction. So it's a little bit confusing. So to try and make this a little easier to tell and hopefully easier to understand, I'm gonna not tell it in the same order that the book does. I'm gonna first go through the first timeline and then we'll pick up where the movie timeline starts and skews off, okay? Hopefully that made sense. Also, since this is a French story, there's a lot of French words, and again, like I always say, like everybody else in the world, I have an accent too, so I'm gonna do my best. I looked them up on Google, I listened to other people say them on the interwebs, and I'm gonna do my best. So once upon a time, there was a kingdom whose name and very existence had been forgotten. Because of its remote location in an out-of-the-way valley, it was a popular place among those who were different than everybody else and who were referred to as les charmantes. Now these people had magical powers and tendencies, and they had fled the rest of Europe to this remote kingdom for safety. The rest of the world was becoming more modernized and more scientific in their thinking, and the Le Chamonts were driven out of the various cities across Europe. But now these mind viruses of civilized men were starting to catch up to this tiny kingdom. And the kingdom also attracted people who, didn't necessarily have magical powers, but were just considered, oddballs or misfits. And one of these oddballs was a young man named Maurice. And Maurice liked to tinker and invent things and figured out how to make things work. Now, when Maurice moved there, he immediately struck up a friendship with another young man named Alaric. Alaric was a stable hand at the palace, and he was dating a very nice head housekeeper at the palace. I wonder who that could be. Now, one evening when Maurice had gotten off work and he was headed to the tavern to meet his friends like he always did after he got off work, he came upon a situation going on in the street in front of the tavern. There was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and she was in some kind of an argument with a guy, and she was holding a magic wand, and she was yelling at the man, and she was saying, "There's nothing unnatural about us. Whatever God makes is natural, and we're all children of God." And the man was like, "You are the children of the devil, and you must be purified." And she was like, "Purified?" She goes, "I was baptized as a child, so that means I've had at least one more bath than you've ever had." I thought that was a pretty good one. Now this upset the man, and he went to his waistband. Now Maurice, watching, knew this meant he was probably going for some kind of a weapon, and he moved to go defend her. But almost immediately there was a flash brighter than lightning, and when Maurice could see again, he saw the woman storming off, and the man had a pig nose. So Maurice chuckled to himself, and he went inside the tavern to meet his friends. And when he found Alaric, he was sitting with a new friend, this kind of insect-looking guy, and he didn't look very happy. So Maurice sits down with them, but he's still, he's thinking about the girl he'd seen outside. Anyway, so he sits down, and his friend Alaric introduces him to his new friend, Frederic. Frederic was new in town because he had a special talent. He could see the future. And Maurice was like, "Oh, really? That's cool." And Frederic's like, "Well, not really. I mean, my parents, they sent me here to be with my own kind and hopefully figure out how to have it removed." He's like, "I was at university. I was about to apprentice for a famous surgeon. I was gonna be a doctor." Okay, I'm gonna let my skincare sit for a few minutes before we move on to makeup. But all that was over now. But he had gotten a job as a health consultant to the king and queen. Their new infant had gotten a cold, and Frederic had been able to cure the child. And the king and queen were so impressed that they were about to give him his own research facility. Now, the only downside was this research facility was on the other side of the river near some unknown village. And Maurice was like, "Oh, wow, that's really interesting. Alaric," he asks Alaric, "Do you know who that girl was out front just a few minutes ago?" And Alaric knew her. Her name was Rosalind. Now, days later, Maurice was back at the tavern, as was his usual routine after work, and he was waiting for his friends to show up. And all of a sudden, Rosalind sits down next to him and strikes up a conversation. And they start talking about their interests and all these things, and they kind of realize they kind of like each other, that they're compatible. And so after this, they start courting. And then sometime after that, they get married. Now, as their relationship went on, there became more and more of these kinds of incidences that had happened with Rosalind and the man outside in their town. And there began to be like actual physical attacks on Les Charmants. And as time was going on, they became more and more frequent. And it always kind of seemed like the palace guards were never around, or they would just look the other way. After some time, Rosalind became pregnant with Belle. And at the same time, these attacks on Les Charmants were becoming more and more brutal, more and more frequent, and more tolerated by those without magic. Les Charmants went missing almost daily, but no bodies were ever found. And in fact, it got so bad that Rosalind and Maurice, after Belle was born, they decided to move to that little village on the other side of the river. But before they did, Rosalind the Enchantress, she decided to go and talk to the king and queen to see if they could intervene on behalf of her people, the Les Charmants. But they refused. They seemed to think that Les Charmants were bad people, that they were a threat to those without magic. And Rosalind was disgusted by their response. And, you know, she's in the castle and it's obvious that they have been overspending tax dollars on their lavish lifestyle. Even their little prince, as a toddler, he was playing with a ball that was made of pure gold. So Rosalind, she stormed out, she left, feeling angry, defeated, and a little bent on revenge. Now, about the time that they moved away, a terrible fever enveloped this tiny kingdom, and a quarantine was put into place. And a lot of non-magical people were blaming the Les Charmants for this fever, like it was some kind of punishment from God for having allowed magic to be practiced in their kingdom. Now, a few years had passed and Belle had grown up, reading ferociously and dreaming and running around barefoot. And back in their old kingdom, the fever had gotten worse. And the king and queen, they had barricaded themselves up in their high castle, keeping the doors closed from any contagion. And nobody was allowed to come or leave the castle, including the servants, which meant their friend, Alaric Potts, who was now married to the head housekeeper. Now, one night after Belle had gone to sleep, a man came to their house and he told Rosalind that the king and queen were summoning her, that they needed to talk to her. And Rosalind was like, I'm not a citizen of that kingdom anymore, so I'm under no obligation to heed their call. The man told her that the fever had gotten now inside the castle walls and was killing royalty and servants alike. And Rosalind looks at Maurice and Maurice is like, you should go. He's like, people need help. And you can check on our friend Alaric. And Rosalind's like, all right, I'll go. My husband is a kinder person than I. Now, at the king and queen's castle, they asked the enchantress to use her magic to help them get rid of this fever. And if she helped them in exchange, they would forgive her crime of having broken quarantine. And Rosalind was offended by this. She was like, I'm not a criminal. She was like, I left this terrible kingdom for a new place. I live in a new place now. She's like, where insults are not hurled at me. My neighbors don't go missing without investigation because of their background. She's like, I'm not gonna help you. You never helped me and my kind. She's like, your words are meaningless to me. She's like, get yourself a doctor and be done with it. But the king and queen told her that none of the doctors had been able to help. Frederic was a gifted surgeon, but he was a terrible healer. And again, Rosalind told them, she's like, because you never helped me or my kind, the Les Chamantes, I'm not going to help you. And she turned to leave. But the queen, she yelled out, she's like, wait, please. She's like, I don't care what happens to us. Just please help my son. He's innocent. She's like, you have a daughter. Surely you can understand that. And Rosalind was like, innocent? She's like, my daughter was innocent and yet threatened because her mother was one of Les Chamantes and you did nothing. You think that your son should be protected, should be safe just because his mother is a queen? And she just looked down, she began to cry, and she just said, please. And Rosalind was like, she's like, you know what, I'll think about it. In the meantime, I want to see my friend Alaric. She's like, I haven't heard from him in a while. And the king was like, Alaric? He's like, oh, you mean the horse fellow? Yeah, he disappeared a while back and just up and left, abandoned his family during quarantine when things got rough. Now, their attitude about her missing friend enraged her, and she stormed out. When she got home, she told Maurice everything. She was like, there must be repercussions for their actions. She's like, magic comes back on you just like the actions of people do. And the bigger the person, the more people their actions affect. And maybe if they live, they'll learn that. Then she told Maurice that, you know, if anything ever happened to her, she would want Belle to be safe. She would want her people to be safe. If anything ever happened to her, she would make sure that everyone forgot about all Les Chamantes. They would become nothing but fairy tales hidden from the eyes of men. And Maurice was like, yeah, that could work. Just, you know, don't include me in that spell because I would never want to forget you. And Rosalind kissed him, but she didn't say anything back. Now, despite the king and queen's walls and doctors and priests and wealth, they ended up getting sick and they died. But shockingly, wonderfully, their son had been spared, and so had all of the children in the castle. A year passed and the fever ran itself out, though it took a staggering amount of the townspeople with it. Now, since the king and queen would be no longer around, it was the prince's time to become the king, and there was going to be a coronation for him. And when Rosalind heard about this, she felt it was her responsibility to go and talk to him and make sure that he wasn't going to be the same kind of ruler that his parents were. But Maurice, he didn't really want her to go because there were still attacks on Les Chamantes. So Rosalind told him, she's like, how about, you know, I go in disguise and then nobody will know I'm Les Chamantes. And this made Maurice feel a little bit better. So she said goodbye to him and to Belle. And before she left, she grabbed one of the red roses that were in a vase on their kitchen table. Now this is where the timeline changes. We're now in the movie timeline, and we're at the part in the movie where Belle is sneaking up to the West Wing, and she sees the enchanted rose, and she goes over to it, and she reaches out to touch it to get a better look. But in this version, she actually does touch the rose. You know, in the movie, The beast ran in and stopped her before she could. Not in this story. And when she touches it, she has a vision. And her vision is a fairy tale. And once upon a time, there was a dying magical kingdom hidden deep in a forest. Inside this once shining castle lived a young prince. And he had everything a person could want. And despite this, he was still spoiled and selfish. The night before he was to be made king, an old beggar woman came to the castle and offered him a single red rose in exchange for shelter from the bitter cold. But repulsed by her haggard appearance, the prince sneered at the gift and turned the old woman away. But she warned him not to be deceived by appearances, for beauty lies within. And when he dismissed her again, the woman's ugliness melted away to reveal a beautiful enchantress. The prince tried to ask for forgiveness, but it was too late, for she had seen that there was no love in his heart. And as punishment, she transformed him into a hideous beast and placed a powerful spell on the castle and all who lived there. She told him that he had until the eve of his 21st birthday to become as beautiful on the inside as he was on the outside. She tells him that if you do not learn to love another and be loved in return, by the time the last petal falls on this rose, you, your castle, and everyone that lives there will be cursed and forgotten forever. Ashamed of his monstrous appearance, the beast concealed himself in the castle and lost all hope, for who could ever learn to love a beast? Now, when Belle snapped out of it, she recognized the enchantress as her own mother. She didn't have a lot of memories of her, but she had enough. She remembered what she looked like, and she recognized her in this vision. Also, when she came to, she was holding the red rose, and it was dissolving, and it disappeared, blew away like dust. And right then, the beast comes barreling in. He's howling in despair. He's yelling. He's like, you ruined my only chance of breaking this curse. Now, just like in the movie, this scared Belle, and she went running into the forest with Philippe. And as she's trying to run away, a pack of wolves start chasing her. She falls off the horse, and right when it seems like they're gonna pounce on her, the beast comes showing up, and he fights off the wolves and he saves Belle. And somehow Belle is able to get the beast onto Philippe's back and gets him back to the castle. Now, unlike the movie at this part, Belle ties the beast up to a chair. She has questions that she wants to ask him, but she doesn't trust him to not lash out at her again. So she's tending to his wounds, and he comes to, and obviously he's very upset about being tied up to a chair, but she is able to kind of calm him down and ask him some questions. Now, when she had touched the rose and seen the vision of her mother cursing him, she didn't really understand why. So she asked the beast, why did she curse you like that? And he's like, I don't know. He was like, I was 11. He's like, what could I have done? And Belle's like, yeah, he has a point. He did seem like he was a terrible little human being, but he was just a boy. She then told him that she was sorry. She was sorry that she touched the rose. She was sorry that she ran away. And she was sorry that the woman that cursed him was my mother. Now, of course, the beast was shocked to hear this. But then he realized, well, if this is her mother, maybe she can convince her, the enchantress, to undo this curse. But, of of course, Belle hadn't seen her mother in over 10 years. So they thought maybe if they could find her, then they could convince her to undo the curse. So Belle untied the beast and they went running to his bedroom to check the magic mirror to see if they could figure out where she was. Now in the beast's bedroom, he picked up the magic mirror. He was like, "Magic mirror, show me the enchantress that put this spell upon me." And the mirror began to kind of fade and fog, but kind of in an odd way. It had a gray fogginess to it that didn't reflect. And the beast is looking at it and he's like, "Oh, it's never done that before." And he's like shaking it to fix it somehow. But it showed them nothing. So then the beast was like, "Well, what about your dad? Does he know where she's at?" And Belle was like, "No." She's like, "I don't think so. He actually never talks about her." And Belle always thought that he didn't talk about her because he was upset about her leaving. But now Belle was starting to think that maybe he didn't talk about her just because he didn't really remember her, kind of in the same way that Belle didn't remember her. I mean, she had, vague memories, vague visuals, and just like feelings about her, but that was about it. So maybe Maurice was the same way. Now that night, Belle woke up in the middle of the night because she heard whispers calling her name. So she went out into the hallway to investigate, and she kept hearing the whispers, and so she follows the whispers down the hall, and she follows the whispers all the way to the stairs that lead to the west wing again. So she goes up the stairs, she turns around, and she sees a statue made of ivy, kind of like a topiary, standing at the foot of the stairs, and its arms are stretched up above its head. And it kind of gives her the creeps, but she continues up the stairs and down the hallway of the west wing. She turns around again, and now the statue is like halfway up the stairs, and its arms are down by its side. Now this really freaks her out, and she goes to run, but she feels a pain in her foot. And she looks down, and there's shards of glass everywhere, of mirror. And on the wall next to her is a frame where obviously all these shards of glass had been. It seemed that the beast had probably broken the mirror in some sort of temper tantrum. Anyway, so she's looking down at these shards of glass, and she sees reflections in them, but they're not of her. Each shard has a different image of her and her mother when she was a child. But then, all of a sudden, all the images turn into this monstrous face, and it's not the beast, it's a different looking monster person. And it scares her, and she starts screaming, and the beast comes charging out of his bedroom, having heard her, and he's actually able to talk her down, calm her down, and get her to go back to sleep. Now the next morning, Belle told the beast that she felt like her mother was like trying to contact her some way. Now they don't know really whether her mother is even alive. They have no idea where she is. But Belle couldn't shake this feeling that her mother was trying to contact her, whether it was from the beyond or not. Belle felt that if she could possibly do some research on her mother, perhaps they could figure out why she cursed the beast. And if they could figure that out, maybe they could figure out how to undo it. But how could she research her mother without access to like census records and stuff? And the beast was like, "Oh," he's like, "we have all that stuff in the library." And Belle's like, "You have a library?" Now this was always my favorite part of the movie, when the beast gives her the library. But in this story, it's a little different. So the beast opens the door to the library, and she goes inside, and she's very impressed. There were 3 stories of books. And Belle's like, "Oh my gosh," she's like, "this place is like a university." She was like, "If I had lived here, I would have spent all my time in here reading." So would I. And the Beast, he's like, I don't know what the big deal is. He's like, they're just books. And Belle is like, just books? She's like, you don't understand. She's like, books can tell us everything that mankind knows or imagines. She's like, I wouldn't have made it in my little village if it wasn't for books. She's like, it made, you know, growing up there far less sad and lonely. And the Beast, he was like, you were sad and lonely? It like concerned him. And she's like, well, you know, yeah. She's like, the town I grew up in was provincial, to say the least. But she's like, you know, we're here to research my mother. So then the Beast takes her over to where all the population records were kept. But when they go to look up her mother, they suddenly realize Belle doesn't even know her name, so they can't look her up. But they did find Belle's birth record, which meant that she was born in this kingdom, not in the tiny village that she had grown up in. But on her birth record, it only named Maurice as a parent. And in the spot where the mother's name should have been was a funny looking symbol. So they were talking, and the Beast mentions a stable master that he was close with when he was a kid had disappeared. So they look his name up, thinking that maybe this symbol was to indicate people who had disappeared, but he didn't have the symbol next to his name. So then they were thinking, okay, well, if this symbol doesn't indicate people who disappeared, maybe it's to indicate people who were les chamans, as a way to keep track of them. Also, Belle realized that Alaric's last name was Potts. She's like, as in like Mrs. Potts? And the Beast was like, oh yeah, they were married. So then it dawns on Belle that all these little animated objects, these little servants of the Beasts had at one point been like actual people. So not only did her mother curse this little boy for the sins of his parents, she also cursed all these innocent servants. This woman is sounding like not a great person. And so the Beast was like, well, you know, maybe your mother was right about me. He was like, you know, I never really thought of my servants as anything other than things that made my life easier. Maybe that's why she did this to me. And Belle was like, perhaps, but you know, she didn't really like the idea of using people as morality lessons. The next day, in the early morning hours, Belle woke up cold. The fire in her bedroom had gone out. So she got up to go down to the kitchen to get more firewood. When she opened the door to her bedroom, that ivy statue was standing right there, and it had its arms stretched out and it was pointing behind Belle. And Belle's like, what? And she turns around. She's like, what, the window? And she turns back around and the statue's gone. So Belle, she walks over to the window, and in the window panes, she can see this scene being played out. A horse with two riders rides up to her house in the village. And the first rider gets off the horse, helps the second rider down. Her mother is standing in the doorway looking kind of nervous, and Maurice comes out and shakes the hand of the first rider. And then the scene repeats, and it just repeats over and over. And Belle watches it over and over until she falls asleep. Now the next day, Belle and the Beast were talking about his parents. And he showed her where they were buried in a cemetery on the castle grounds. And he showed her where the headstones were. He was like, you know, I was 10 when they died. And they had done everything that they were supposed to do. They locked them all up in the castle. They quarantined. They were drinking all these disgusting tonics. And everybody else in the castle survived. Everyone but them. why had none of those same things worked for them? They were, they went from fever to dead in like 3 days. And he was telling her how, he was barely allowed to see them to keep him safe. And he never got to say goodbye. So now we know why in the movie, when Belle said to him that she never even got to say goodbye to her father, why it kind of touched him and changed his approach. Anyway, he goes on to tell her that, whatever remained of the court after that fled. And when it was time for his coronation the night before, and Belle finishes his sentence and she's like, my mother showed up and cursed you and she turned you into a beast. And he was like, well, I think I was well on my way to becoming a beast anyway. And the beast thinking out loud, and he's like, it was unfair that she cursed an 11-year-old or a 10-year-old. I think it was 11, yeah, because it was a year later. Anyway, it was pretty rotten of her to curse an 11-year-old. But, why did she come on the night before the coronation? He couldn't help but think that she came that night to make sure that he wasn't going to be the terrible ruler that his parents were. Like it was some kind of a test. But he failed the test. And Belle's like, I'm so sorry, Beast. And I always thought it was weird that in the movie she just called him Beast, like Beast was his name. And we never get his name. And he was like, well, I used to have a name, a real name. And I was like, oh yes, finally, we're gonna get the Beast's name. And Belle's like, what is it? And I'm like, yeah, what is it? And he's like, it doesn't matter. He's like, even if I turn back into a person, I'm never gonna be that person again. And this saddened Belle, and her eyes started to well up, and the Beast noticed, and he was like, oh no, he's like, it's okay. He's like, it's not that bad. He's like, not all change is bad. He's like, you're, starting to make me realize that. And Belle, she puts her hand on his paw, and she's like, yeah, it's okay. We're gonna figure this out together. And then he puts his arm around her, and she kind of leans into his warm side. Now back at the village, Gaston was having a meeting at the town tavern with Monsieur Dark. Now, I'm not saying his name properly. I can't say it. I tried so many times to say his name with the French accent, and it just comes out terribly. So I'm sorry. I'm just gonna have to say it with my own accent. He's the guy in charge of the insane asylum, and Gaston wants Monsieur Dark to help him blackmail Belle into marrying him by putting her father, Maurice, into the insane asylum. And the only way for her to get him out is for her to marry Gaston. Now, Monsieur Dark is like, Maurice is harmless, but I love the idea. I'm going to be using an appropriate palette. Back at the castle, Belle had asked the Beast to show her where the stables were. Since the night before, the vision had shown a rider on a horse, she thought, oh, what the heck, I'll start there. So when they get inside of the stables, the Beast, he kind of smells something. He starts sniffing around, and he sniffs his way to a stall. And in this stall, there's a little area in the corner where the dirt is uneven. And he starts digging around in there, and he digs down and down, and after a few moments, they find a old, dry, rotted corpse. The Beast could tell by his clothes that this was Alaric Potts. He had a surgeon's scalpel sticking out of his sternum. So the Beast patted down his body and they found his journal on him, and they started reading it. And from the journal, they found out that Alaric knew Belle's mother. and that they were working together to help smuggle Les Charmants out of the kingdom. And this must have been why he was murdered. So maybe that meant Belle's mother had been murdered too. So they buried Alaric in a plot reserved for royalty, and they had a hero's funeral, and the whole castle attended. Now, at the same time, Maurice had been trekking through the forest. He was trying to get back to the castle to rescue Belle. He had gone to the tavern, just like in the movie, to try and get help, but nobody had believed him. So he decided he would just go alone. On his way, Gaston and Le Fou came up behind him. And Maurice is like, "Oh, this is great. You decided to come after all." He's like, with you along, this great hunter, he's like, "Surely we'll be able to subdue the beast." And Maurice is like, "Where's your hunting musket?" And Gaston starts to laugh, and he's like, yeah. He's like, "Subdue the beast. Oh, Maurice, you really are a riot." He's like, "Why don't you just make this easier on everyone and just come quietly?" And Maurice is like, "Come quietly?" And then it dawns on him what's going on here. And he's like, "You have to believe me." He's like, "I'm not making this up." He's like, "You have to help me." And Gaston is like, "I don't think I can help you, Maurice, but Monsieur Dark probably can." And then Maurice is knocked unconscious. Now back at the castle, Belle and the beast and everyone had a very, emotionally trying day with the funeral and all. And the beast and Belle decided they needed to do something nice for themselves, something to cheer themselves up. So Belle read Jack and the Beanstalk to the beast. And after the story was over, they got to talking about stories and books, and Belle mentioned the bookseller that she used to always visit, Monsieur Levi. And the beast was like, "Monsieur Levi?" He's like, "That name sounds familiar." And he grabs one of the census books and looks him up. And he's like, "Yeah, I thought I had seen that name before." And it had one of those strange symbols next to his name. They also saw his birthday and saw that he was over 100 years old. If he was one of Les Charmants, surely he knew her mother, them having lived in the same village and all. So they decided they needed to go talk to him. So they went under the shroud of night so that the beast wouldn't be seen. And they go back to the village. And by the time of night that it is when they get there, most of the shops are closed and the streets are almost entirely empty. Still, to be safe, the beast slinked from shadow to shadow predatorially. When they got to the bookstore, they had found that it had been burnt down. And so they're rummaging through the rubble, and Belle finds a mirror. And it fogs up and it gets all magically, and it starts showing all these various scenes. So Belle and the beast watch, and it shows them the entire history of his kingdom. They saw everything that had happened with the Les Charmants, how they had been persecuted, how Belle's parents and Alaric Potts were sneaking them out of the kingdom. And it showed Belle's mother beseech the king and queen for help. It then showed the enchantress back at home, and she was waving her fingers in the air and staring off into the distance. Then it shows the castle and all these magically, sparkly pieces floating down over the castle, kind of like rose petals, and they would disappear when they would hit the ground. Then they see the young prince sleeping and these same magically little sparkles falling on him, and he's sleeping happily. Then it cuts to her mother giving Levi the mirror that they're holding. And then it fades back to a regular mirror. So Belle was like, she was giving this mirror to Monsieur Levi like she knew something bad might happen to her. So she was thinking about me. She didn't just leave. She didn't just abandon her family. And Belle was like, what was that last part where she was like casting a spell? And the Beast was like, well, you know, he's like, none of the children in the castle ever got sick. He's like me. He was like, I was fine. And everyone said it was like a miracle, but maybe it was your mother. He's like, but what do we do now? And Belle's like, I think we should go see my father. Maybe he can clear things up. Maybe if we show him this, he'll remember, or his memories will be freed up or something. So let's go to my old home. So when they got to her house, she told the Beast, she's like, maybe you better hide in the bushes. I don't want my father to see you just yet, since, the last time he saw you, you were throwing him in prison. And she didn't want him to just freak out. So the Beast, he hides. She tells him, she's like, it'll only be a couple minutes. She goes inside and he waits. But after some time, she still hadn't come back. He kind of started to worry. So he goes inside very quietly, very gently, but she's not there. Nobody's there. So he's sniffing around, looking for clues. He can tell that Belle had been there, and some other people whose scent he didn't recognize. And he couldn't find anything. So then he remembers, oh yeah, we brought the magic mirror with us. And he had it in his cape. And he pulls it out and he's like, show me Belle. And it shows Belle tied up with a gag, and she's bouncing around in some sort of padded carriage. And there's a hooded assailant there, like holding her down. He runs out the front door, he looks up and down the road, and just rounding a bend, he sees a black carriage. He goes running after it, full out on all fours. And he follows it to the end of a road where there's a big, black, ominous looking building. And it actually kind of reminded him of his castle, except there were no windows, except on the very top floors. And when the wind blew just right, you could hear screams coming from the building. This was the insane asylum. So the carriage goes through the front gate, but the Beast can't follow it because there are men guarding the gates with muskets. So he realized he needed reinforcements. Inside the insane asylum, Belle was thrown into a barred cell. And after her captors walked away, she heard coughing coming from the cell next to her. And she recognized that it was her father. So they run towards each other and they put their arms through the bars and they're hugging each other. And Maurice is like, you got away from the Beast. And she was like, yeah. And then I came to find you and I got thrown in here for some reason. And she's like, it's a long story, but the Beast isn't bad, Papa. She's like, we have to help him. And she's like, but what happened to you? What are you doing in here? And Maurice is like, I tried to get help to come and find you, but no one at the tavern would help me. Then Gaston and LeFou grabbed me when I was walking back to the castle to come get you. And he's like, Gaston and Dark, they're in this together. Their plan was to kidnap me to force you to marry Gaston. He's like, but Belle, he's like, we don't have much time and I have to tell you something. Your mother is an enchantress. And Belle's like, I know. And Maurice is like, you know? He looked confused. And Belle's like, why didn't you ever tell me? And Maurice is like, well, I couldn't really remember exactly. He's like, I think, there was some kind of forget spell or something to protect us. And Belle's like, well, how come you can remember now? And Maurice is like, because I saw her. She's here. Your mother's here. And Belle gasps. She's like, wait, she's here? And he's like, oh, Belle. She's like, yes, she's been here. She's like, she didn't just leave us. She was kidnapped and brought here. He's like, they took her and they've been taking all the magic out of her. He's like, that's what Dark does. He finds les chamans and he tortures the magic out of them. He's like, I saw her and she's a mangled mess. She's like your beautiful, strong mother. She's looks like a monster. And then Belle remembers the monstrous face that she had seen in the broken mirror. It was her mother, now that she's thinking about it. The woman who had cursed the beast was now this mangled, scared victim of torture. And Belle's thinking to herself, she's like, so my mother, didn't just up and leave me. She was kidnapped, brought here, tortured, and she was still able to summon enough strength to try and reach me? Then 2 people come into her cell. They look like nurses. And one of them's like, okay, she's like, the doctor is ready to examine you now. And they grab her and they force her out of the cell. Now the beast had raced back to his castle to try and get help. But when he got there, all his animate object servants were suddenly inanimate. There were no responses from them. Like the curse was like taking its full effect, or like they were dead or something. Now that part wasn't in the animated movie, but I think it was in the live action. Now Belle, back at the insane asylum, had been taken to a truly frightening room. There were these wheeled tables everywhere that looked like they were ready to receive patients, and there were metal trays with white linen laid out, and on top of those were a bunch of shiny, sharp looking instruments. She was forced onto a table and strapped down, and one of the orderlies draped a rag over her mouth that smelled of chloroform. Then they wheeled her into a operating theater, and she hears Dark's voice, and she knows it's Dark because despite the fact that he didn't really come into town very much, all the villagers knew who he was. Anyway, so she hears him talking, and he's like, I apologize for all of this, and I just need to be sure that you're pure, that you're not tainted of the supernatural. And Belle's like, what is this? Is this for Gaston? And he's like, Gaston? He's like, that bull of a boy? He's like, please. He's like, he's no more than a pawn. He thinks I actually approve of his silly wedding plans. So Dark had just been using Gaston to get information about Belle and her father. Then Belle was like, why did you burn down Monsieur Levi's bookshop? And he was like, I did nothing of the sort. He's like, I suspect that was the idiot Gaston. He's like, I have nothing against books. I love books. Books are the remedy to superstition and magic. He wheels over the scariest looking machine that Belle had ever seen, and Belle's seen a lot of machines considering what her father does. And he begins to pump at a foot pedal at the bottom of it. And she's like, no, please, please. And he's like, shh, it's okay. And he takes like this funnel thing that's attached to a hose, and he puts it over her mouth. And she's fighting and she's thrashing back and forth, but despite her efforts, the blackness begins to drip over her senses. Now, back at the castle, the beast had thrown a temper tantrum when he realized what had happened to his servants. But he realized he needed to keep it together so that he could rescue Belle. So he goes to the magic mirror and he asks it to show him Belle. And he's like, mirror, show me Belle. And it shows her strapped down to a terrible looking table and she's drugged and she's feebly kicking, and there's an old man sticking needles in her. Now, there was no way that the beast could take on all the guards by himself, so he needed help, but the servants obviously were all unavailable. So the only people left to help him were the people of the village, the people with hunting muskets, and who would probably shoot him on sight or at least run away screaming. But he had no choice, so he heads back to the village. Now, back at the asylum, Belle was starting to come to, and she could hear Dark's voice talking to the staff. And he was saying, he was like, it's just as I suspected all those years ago. She has no magic in her. But you know what? Keep her anyway. She's valuable. She can lure in a much bigger prey, the beast that Gaston had been talking about. Dark's like, I believe this beast is the same prince that her mother cursed all those years ago. He's like, how's that for irony? And Belle's thinking to herself, she's like, how does he know all this? Belle realized that she had seen Dark in the images back at the bookstore. She realized that he had been friends with her parents and with Alaric Potts. Now, the beast had gone to the tavern to try and get the village people to help him. But when he got there, of course, they were all terrified. Gaston was there and he pulled his musket out on him, pointed it at him, and he's like, oh, so the beast is real, just like Maurice had said. He's like, we should kill him. Now, the beast could tell from his scent that this was Gaston, the hunter that he had seen only from afar in the forest, and who Belle had told him about. But the beast pleaded with Gaston to help him rescue Belle. He used the magic mirror to show everyone there what was really going on. And even Gaston looked shocked at what he saw in the mirror. Like maybe he was thinking something like, that wasn't part of the deal. But Gaston was insistent that they kill the beast and then rescue Belle. But the beast got down on his knees and he begged him to please help him rescue Belle. He's like, after that, you can do whatever you want with me. You can chain me up, you can kill me, whatever you want. Just help me rescue Belle first. And reluctantly, Gaston agreed. Back at the insane asylum, Belle was still strapped down to that table. Dark and the staff had left, locking the door behind them. And then all of a sudden, her restraints came unbuckled. But she wasn't going to stick around to try and figure out how. So she just got up and she used a scalpel to unlock the door and escape. She came upon a storage room. The room had, a bunch of supplies in it, chamber pots, robes, and there was a female orderly in there getting the dinner trays ready. So Belle grabs one of the empty chamber pots and she hits her over the head with it and she grabs her keys. Now, Belle's plan was simple. She was just gonna unlock all the cell doors, let all the prisoners free, Les Charmantes and the truly insane, and just let chaos reign while she found her mother and father. So she's going from cell to cell, unlocking all the doors, and she comes to the last cell. And she sees that monstrous face that she had seen in the broken mirror, her mother. Belle runs over to her and she's like, Mother! And the woman looks at her and she's like, Belle! She was like, oh my God. She's like, this is the only reason I am still living for this day. And Belle's like, we have to go. And her mother is just like, wait, let me just get a look at you. She's like, oh, you're so beautiful. You're so strong. You're everything I could have ever wanted in a daughter. And Belle's fighting back the tears and she's like, why did you make me forget you? And the woman, she's like, not just you, all Charmantes. She's like, never again would people remember where they lived and be able to hunt them down. And with you and Maurice forgetting, you'd be protected too, though it seems to not have worked. And Belle's like, but how is Dark able to do all this? How come he didn't forget? And her mother explains to her that he is Le Chamant. Like, you know, the curse did not include their memory. They all remembered. And her mother's like, you know, I was such a fool, like cursing a little boy. And when I felt you bring down the curse, it was like my soul was ripped in two. She's like, magic came back on itself and I have been punished accordingly. Her mother was like, so that's why with the little magic that I had left was trying to reach you. Then I freed you from the gurney in the operating room. Then all of a sudden, one of the human-looking prisoners stuck his head into the cell and he's like, come on, we gotta go, the guards are coming. Hurry, Rosalind. And that's the first time Belle heard her mother's name. So Belle puts her arm around her, she helps her up, and when they get outside of the cell, it's the chaos that Belle had been hoping for. People running around, screaming, yelling. So she's like, come on, we gotta go get Papa. So they made their way to Maurice's cell, and when they all saw each other, they embraced as a family, but they needed to get going. So they make their way outside. And when they get out there, it is chaos. There are people running everywhere in various stages of dress and distress. All the guards are trying to corral them and get them back inside. It's some kind of hellish landscape, like something painted by Bosch. Now in the distance were a bunch of flickering lights coming up the road. It was Gaston leading the villagers. Belle was like, yeah, why don't we go around this? Anything involving Gaston usually didn't end well for her. So the family, they're sneaking across the lawn. They're trying to keep close to the wall of the asylum so they're not seen. Their plan was to just get to the road and just keep going. But then they run into Dark, standing right there waiting for them. He had a musket raised and it pointed at them. And Maurice was baffled. They had been friends. And Maurice is like, how did you manage all this? How did you kidnap all these people? He's like, I had the full support of the king and queen. They had wanted to rid themselves of the Chamant problem. And when they heard about my theories and opinions on the matter, they gave me a generous stipend and the money to buy this asylum. And Rosalind is like, been behind the disappearances this whole time. And again, Maurice is just like, how could you do this? We had been friends. And Dark is like, you know, my apologies for having to kidnap your pure self and your pure daughter, but you were just bait. I was after bigger prey, so to speak. And Belle realized he was talking about the beast. And Dark saw the realization in Belle's eyes. He's like, yes, I made the connection when I heard Gaston talking about Maurice's beast in the woods. I realized it was the young princeling, all grown up, kind of. And Rosalind was like, you need to leave him be. And Dark is like, I can't just let a monster roam free in our countryside. Besides, he's like, who are you to tell me to let things be? You who go around cursing princes into these unnatural things. Rosalind looks down and she's just like, I made a mistake, but killing the prince isn't gonna help or change anything. And then Belle's like, and you know what? You also killed Alaric Potts. You knew that he was rescuing Chamants out of the kingdom. And when you found out, you killed him, and then you went after Mama. Then Dark raises his musket towards them, and that's when the beast comes charging out of the darkness and jumps on him. And the beast goes to claw his throat out, but Belle stops him, and she's like, no, no, no. She's like, You're not a murderer. You're not a beast. And the beast, he's like, yeah, I guess you're right. He takes Dark and he pulls him to his feet and he says, the girl that you just kidnapped and tortured just saved your life. So you better thank her. And Dark is like, oh, I do thank her for her human inclinations towards mercy and pity. And then he says, you see, to the crowd that had been forming around them, he says, you see, this is what I have been protecting you from for all those years. And someone's like, yeah, but what about Belle? She's not supernatural and you kidnapped and tortured her. The crowd was starting to turn on Dark. And he began to try to, explain himself. But all of a sudden, his body did this weird, like, jerking movement. And blood started to pool on his shirt around his stomach area. And then he falls forward, revealing Gaston standing behind him with his dripping hunting machete. He stood there with his chest out, proud of what he has just done. And he says, I have vanquished the villain who has been preying on our town and its innocent loonies. He's like, come, let us lock up the beast like we said we were going to do. But nobody said or moved. He's like, there's only one way to end this terrible story on a less somber note. And he turns to face Belle. He gets down on one knee and he's like, Belle, will you marry me? All she said back was, Gaston, did you burn down Monsieur Levi's bookstore? And he starts stammering and he's like, well, yes, but I was looking for Maurice. Dark told me he might be there. And he told me that, Levi was not a good person. But even as he's saying the words, he's realizing how ridiculous they sound. But of course, he persists and he's like, well, books are dangerous. He's like, look what they did to you. They turned you into whatever you are, a girl who doesn't want to marry me. Me, Gaston. All the girls want to marry me. And you could tell by the looks on the faces in the crowd that the town was kind of turning on their favorite son. And Belle turns to the crowd and she goes, yeah, I will not be marrying Gaston. And we will not be locking up the beast. He is a prince, no, a king of a magical kingdom that all of you have seemed to have forgotten, but may start to remember now. And he has freed his people. He's a hero. So the crowd starts to dissipate. And the Beast and Belle, they go into each other's arms and they're comforting each other. And after a few moments, Belle's mother walks up to the Beast and she tells him that, there's nothing I can do to make up for what I did and that she was sorry. She said that, she thought she had been saving the kingdom. She thought she was avenging everyone that the king and queen had hurt, but there were vaster consequences than she had anticipated. The Beast said thank you, and that, I think as my first official act as king, I'm going to give amnesty and forgiveness to everyone. And Rosalind was impressed by this. She's like, wow, she's like, you've managed to recover your mind and soul all on your own. She's like, as long as you and Belle love one another, the curse isn't broken, but it is mediated. So he wouldn't become more of a beast than he already was. Then she told him that she thought maybe, just maybe, she might have enough magic left to turn him back into a human like he deserved. And he was like, well, can you change my servants back as well? And she was like, no, I don't think I have enough magic for that. If I release you from the curse, there won't be any magic left for them. And the Beast was like, well, I think I'd rather have that. I think I would rather you turn them all back into their previous form and just let me stay a beast. And Rosalind was like, well, you know, if that's what you want, that's what we'll do. And so Belle and the beast, they start hugging again. They're happy, but they're also kind of sad because they had hoped, you know, that he was going to be changed back so that, you know, they could be together as a couple, like a normal couple. But they were going to stay together even though he was in his form. And they would try to, you know, continue to figure this out. So the next day, they all go back to the castle. And Rosalind was able to change all the servants back. Her magic lasted till the very last servant. So after a few days of celebration at the castle and a few days of Rosalind resting and healing, she told the beast and Belle that she'd been, you know, thinking about their situation, and she was pretty sure that with an adequate gathering of shamans, there would be enough magic to change him back. And the beast was like, yeah, but there's very few shamans left. The only ones left are the ones that they had rescued from the insane asylum. But Rosalind was like, oh no. She was like, there were many who had gotten out of the kingdom before things got too dire. All he had to do was find them and bring them back there. And the beast blinks and he's like, go find them. He's like, me? And Belle's like, yeah, why not? She's like, you would finally be able to go out into the world that you've just been watching through your magic mirror. And the beast is like, well, with you? He's like, I could do anything with you. And Belle thought about it, and you know, she had just found her mother, and there was so much she wanted to talk to her about, and she wasn't really sure she wanted to leave her just yet. But this was her chance to finally go out and see the world, and who knows what they could see while they're out there trying to find reclusive shamans. And Belle's mother looks at her and she says, you know, you should go. She's like, you know, I'm always gonna be here. You can always come back. She's like, everyone should have a journey. Everyone should go out into the world, have an adventure, and then have a home to come home to as well. You know, go out into the world for your adventure and come home for love. And the beast looks at her and he's like, so will you come with me? Will you help me? He's like, you know, we may not succeed. I may always be a beast. And Belle looks at him and she says, but you will always be a prince. The end. Yeah. Not the ending I was hoping for. I was hoping for the happy ending, the happily ever after, just like in the movie. I mean, they didn't exactly say that he wasn't gonna be turned back into a prince, but they didn't say he was. Yeah. So does that mean that so she had a romantic relationship with a beast? That was always kind of strange to me in this story. A little, I don't know. This one it was okay. Not one of my favorites. I thought it was a little all over the place. There was a lot we didn't discuss, a lot that I left out because it was just like, well, besides for the sake of time, but there was just a lot going on. There was stuff I didn't even touch on. There were these weird magical webs everywhere trying to pull down the castle. Like it was a lot. It was a lot. And it felt a little messy. The other thing that I was like, what? Is, so the enchantress, you know, she couldn't change back both the beast and the servants. But it was like, so she had enough magic to change all the servants back, but not one beast. I don't know. Seems like if you had enough for all the servants, you would have enough for the beast too. I don't know. Holes. So that is the story, the twisted tale of Beauty and the Beast. And what would have happened if Belle's mother had cursed the beast and she touched the rose? If you liked this video, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. It's how I know what videos people like, what I should be spending my time on. And if you want, you could possibly hit the notifications bell so that you won't miss another time, another video where I do a story and do my makeup at the same time. And remember, just because everyone is doing it doesn't mean it's right. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.
Look at this cute. Don't wake you. Oh, I'm sorry. I was gonna say what a good girl you were today. Yeah, you didn't bark at me or demand my attention once while Mommy was working. I'm so proud of you. Yeah, you want a treat for that? You get a treat. Okay, hold on. Here you go. Here you go. Good girl. You're such a good girl. Oh, you don't want it? Oh, you do want it. Okay.
And who were and they had why can't I talk already? It just started. What was that? Then it cuts to Lexi's snoring. And then she realized she had seen dark in those images back at the castle, or no,